Dobro večer, poštovani gledalci. Zadovoljstvo mi je da vas pozdravim i da vam poželim dobrodošlicu u ovaj razgovor sa profesorom Kennetom Morrisonom, istoričarem koji veoma dobro poznaje prilike u Crnoj Gori, ali i u regionu. Povod za ovaj razgovor je nedavno objavljena knjiga Crna Gora i Srbija, baršunasti razvod. Ovu knjigu profesor Morrison napisao je u koautorstvu sa profesorom Veskom Garčevićem i u njoj prate istorijsku trajektoriju razvoja političkih, ekonomskih i svih drugih odnosa između Srbije i Crne Gore u 21. vijeku. Razgovor sa profesorom Morrisonom nastavit ćemo dalje na engleskom jeziku. Good evening. Welcome to the Montenegrin Political Science Association talk with Professor Kenneth Morrison. And I would like to use this opportunity to thank Professor Morrison for agreeing to take part in this talk, and also to thank Television E for supporting the production of this show. I already made a very short introduction in Montenegrin, so now I would like to say something, or just to jump straight into the conversation. Professor Morrison, you've written numerous articles and at least 3 books specifically about Montenegrin politics and history. So let's start the conversation with the origins of your interest in Montenegrin history and politics. When did you develop such an interest?
Well, my interest in, good evening, and thank you very much for inviting me onto this program. It's a real pleasure for me to have the opportunity to speak to an audience in Montenegro about my work. And look, in answer to your question, my interest in Montenegro goes back to my time as an undergraduate student. I was studying history, politics, and international relations as an undergraduate. I became very interested in Yugoslavia, the former Yugoslavia, but specifically interested in Montenegro. And the reason for that was every time I tried to find out something about Montenegrin politics or some detail about what was going on in Montenegro as opposed to, let's say, Croatia or Serbia or even Bosnia-Herzegovina, you could only find information about Montenegro in very small parts of the book or in footnotes. There was nothing substantial written about Montenegro in the English language. And I remember once I went to my university library, I found a wonderful book there about Montenegro in the 19th century, early 20th century. It's called The Falcon and the Eagle. It's a book written by an American academic called John Treadway. And I loved that book. It was fantastic, and I wanted to read more. So I went to my local library, the city library in the place where I lived at that time, called Aberdeen, a city called Aberdeen, and went to the library there. They had one book about Montenegro that had been written, I think, in about 1912 or 1913, something like that, certainly prior to the First World War. And I went to get it from the library, and they said, well, it's not possible to access this. We're going to have to get it from stores. No one's taken this out for a long time. And I took the book out, and the last person that had taken the book from the library was in 1924. And this was, I don't know, sometime in the mid to late 1990s that I was taking this book from the library. So it demonstrated that Montenegro, in terms of the European consciousness, Montenegro had kind of disappeared during the 20th century because, of course, it had been absorbed after the assembly of Podgorica into eventually into the kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, the kingdom of Yugoslavia, and then, of course, the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. So, you couldn't really find anything specifically about Montenegro, and that's where the real interest began. My first visit there was in the late 1990s. I can never remember the specific date, but I think 1999 at some point. I was in Montenegro and just became fascinated by politics there. And of course, the 1990s was a very interesting time. The DPS split had happened just a year or two before. And Montenegro was clearly on that trajectory towards independence, which eventually came in 2006, and I was fortunate enough to be there to witness that whole process take place. I was there for the referendum, went to numerous pro and anti-independence rallies in advance of the referendum. So there's a strange thing as an academic, why do you choose a particular thing? Why did I choose Montenegro and not something else? It just spoke to me, I think, in a way that no other country did and no other history did. And I found the history of Montenegro in particular, the 18th and 19th centuries, fascinating. So that was really the beginning of my journey towards what became an academic life. Much of my academic life I've spent focusing specifically on Montenegro. I've branched out a little bit to write about Bosnia-Herzegovina or Sanjak, but which of course part of is still in Montenegro. But Montenegro has been the main focus of my academic work.
Well, I would say that it's not really unusual for people who gain deep knowledge about the region to fall in love with it specifically. And I also want to go back to something that you said regarding the fact that Montenegro kind of disappeared from the European memory, but we'll get back to that point. First, I want to ask you a question about the way in which you named the book itself. So you and Vesko chose the title Montenegro and Serbia, a velvet divorce with a question mark. And maybe let's start from the beginning, from the end of the book or from the conclusion. Can we use the same attribute, velvet, to describe the relationship between Serbia and Montenegro since 2006 and since the independence referendum? Or is this dynamic a bit more complex than just calling it velvet?
It's more complex, which is precisely why we included the question mark at the end, because of course the term velvet divorce is normally used to describe the break between the Czech Republic and Slovakia when it eventually happened in 1993. And of course Czechoslovakia had got rid of the communists in 1989, but they didn't actually. Czechoslovakia existed until the velvet divorce. Now, the velvet divorce was quite a smooth transition when it came to Czech Republic and Slovakia. But with Serbia and Montenegro, it was always much more complex, because if you think about the Czech Republic as being, a dominant force in Slovakia or in Slovak politics, it really isn't. The two are very separate entities. They're both independent states. They respect each other's independence. I think the problem with the relationship between Montenegro and Serbia was that, historically, of course, Montenegro and Serbia have been very close. Interestingly, going back to, talking about those early history books that I was reading about Montenegro, authors, whether they were from the region or whether they were, writing in the English language, or whether they were Americans or Brits or Germans or whatever, would always say the same thing, which was that, Montenegrins are Serbs in all but name. Montenegrins and Serbs are very close. Montenegrins and Serbs are brothers and so forth. It's not that they were explicitly negating Montenegrin identity, but there was this in historiography, a sense that Serbia and Montenegro, okay, maybe slightly different entities, but Serbs and Montenegrins, Orthodox Serbs and Montenegrins, were essentially the same people. So I think that for many in Serbia, for some of the nationalist intellectual elite, for many certainly nationalist politicians in Serbia, the idea that Montenegro could become independent and thrive as an independent state was a real problem for them, because Montenegro is pivotal to the idea of Greater Serbia. There can be no Greater Serbia really without Montenegro. Montenegro is pivotal to that project. And if you're a proponent of that project, and we know that, those people exist, then the loss of Montenegro was significant. And, I spoke to many people who were against independence during the referendum, and they expressed that this just might be a temporary transition, essentially. Montenegro is going through a particular journey, as it had in the past. In 1878, it had become recognized as an independent state, but it had lost that independence by 1918. So, some believed it was a temporary arrangement, and that someday Montenegro and Montenegrins would come back to the bosom of Serbia, come back to their roots, and so forth. So the very premise of the relationship is more complex for those reasons. But also because, of course, as we know, the independence referendum, it was closely fought. It was actually a very positive campaign. It wasn't too bitter these things can become. And referendums, and I live in the UK, and we went through our own referendum over Brexit, and it turned out to be a very bitter affair that's really divided the country in a very negative way. The referendum in Montenegro was professionally run by both sides. It was a zero-sum game in a sense. It could have been much worse. It passed off very peacefully, but at the end of the day, you still had 44.5% of the population had voted to remain in union with Serbia. So that's always going to be a complex situation because a little less than half of the population wanted to remain in union with Serbia. There's a huge sentiment, particularly among those kind of nationalist political elites or academics that we were discussing, that believe that Montenegro and Serbia should be together in one state. So it was never going to be an easy break or a clean break. And I think that's what's made the relationship between Montenegro and Serbia since 2006 so complicated. There's a lot of historical baggage. There's a lot of historical weight there that has determined the relationship between the two since then.
You mentioned that throughout the campaign for referendum in 2006, you talked with several people who shared a very similar worldview that kind of places Montenegrin independence as a historical episode. And that's a formulation that you actually used in the book as well, that Montenegrin independence is a historical episode and a historical anomaly, to be precise. So I wanted to ask you, from this distance of 20 years, we are facing, or in May, it will be 20 years since the referendum and since the independence. Can we say that this independence story is settled, both within the elites and within the electorates in Serbia, but also in Montenegro as well?
I think it is as settled as it can be in the kind of world that we live in at the moment. And of course, if we think about how Montenegro lost its independence, let's say in 1918, the reason for that was that you had this huge rupture. You had the First World War and the impact that had on both Serbia and Montenegro, and of course the occupation of Montenegro by the Austrians, the occupation of Serbia. It was essentially war that created the kingdom of Serbs, Croats and Slovenes. It wasn't an organic process, so to speak. It was very dramatic circumstances from which it was created. For me, and I think we made this case in the book, this is no historical anomaly. I mean, Montenegro has a state tradition. It has a identity. Montenegro is a country. It's not just some kind of region of Serbia. I think joining NATO in 2017 was pivotal for Montenegro in terms of, Montenegro aligned itself after independence very closely with kind of Euro-Atlantic forces and Euro-Atlantic integration, which was the right thing for Montenegro to do at that time. And of course, there was a huge divergence in foreign policy between Montenegro after 2006 and Serbia after 2006. But I think there will always be those nationalist elites, whether they be in Montenegro or whether they be in Serbia, that quietly negate Montenegro's right to exist as a state, quietly negate Montenegrin identity. But Montenegrin independence is a reality. Montenegro is a sovereign state. Montenegro is a member of the United Nations. It's a member of NATO. It's hopefully soon to become a member of the European Union. So I think Montenegro's sovereignty is in many respects safer in an international perspective than it's ever been. But of course, the conditions, all of our conditions depend on what happens geopolitically. And I think, in a sense, it's the geopolitical pressure that's going to be felt over the next few years more than domestic pressure. And anything can happen in the current geopolitical context. But, if Europe can remain in a situation where we don't find ourselves in some kind of armed conflict in the next year or next few years, then I think that, state sovereignty is Montenegro's independence, continuation of independence is Montenegro's future.
You also mentioned that since 2006 there was a divergence between internal political dynamics but also foreign policy alignments in Montenegro and in Serbia, and the book deals with explaining those divergent trajectories in both countries. In this regard, I wanted to ask you, it's also related to something that I found very interesting in the book, that when we go back to these addresses that we already discussed from nationalist circles, that sometimes Montenegrin politics, or specifically this divergence, is characterized as an anti-Serbian politics. Would you say that is the case, or that it's actually a value-based divergence between the two countries since 2006?
Well, I mean, I can give you my view. Of course, it depends who you speak to. There will be those that say, no, Montenegro is taking this particular road or heading down this trajectory because they're being anti-Serb. They're doing what Serbia isn't doing as a matter of policy, and that policy is itself anti-Serb. I don't think that's the case. I suspect it's more about values. And I think one of the things that Montenegro did very effectively after 2006 is they made it clear from a foreign policy perspective that the European Union and NATO was their future, and Euro-Atlantic integration was the main foreign policy priority of the Montenegrin government. Serbia has taken a different route, and Serbia has taken a different route for numerous historical reasons, not least, of course, what happened with the Kosovo War in 1998, 1999, and then the NATO intervention and bombing of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia that year. There's no appetite, or very little appetite, in Serbia to join NATO. Serbia hasn't made huge strides towards the European Union. You get the impression that there's not that same desire that there was in Montenegro to complete the Euro-Atlantic integration project. But I think ultimately, when I speak to Montenegrins of a certain age, regardless of how they define themselves and regardless of how they might, declare their national identity in a census, the 1990s had been really very tough for many people. Many people had lost or had good lives. It had been difficult in the 1980s with the economic crisis that hit Montenegro particularly hard. There was a lot of closures of factories, lots of strikes. There was a lot of industrial unrest at that time. But the 1990s were really tough, and I think people were looking towards a different future, and that future was, and of course we're talking, and we can come back to talk about European Union integration. That future was Europe. Montenegro's future was there. It was in the West. It was Euro-Atlantic integration. And I think it was the logical decision for the Montenegrin government to make after 2006, after the referendum, because what other choice would they have made in foreign policy terms at that time? But of course, Serbia took a very different road, and their decisions were different. But that foreign policy divergence has certainly been part of what has underpinned the tension between Belgrade and Podgorica since 2006.
Also, one of the very interesting parts of the book, at least that's what I found, it's a discussion of various channels of influence within these two countries. And you start this discussion by saying that if you look at historical sources, that we can see Montenegro has almost no influence on internal political dynamics in Serbia. But the other way around is not really the same, that Serbia influences the developments in Montenegrin politics to a large extent. What would be the main channels of this influence? And who would you say is the biggest, quote-unquote, Serbian player in Montenegro, maybe in the past 10 years or so?
Well, I mean, it's true, Montenegrins don't have, individual Montenegrins might have some political influence in Serbia. But as a group, as a diaspora, not a great deal of political influence at all. Yes, in Montenegro, you have significant influence from Serbia, in the same way that you have in Republika Srpska, and certainly in North Kosovo. The certain Serbian political parties, Serbian intellectuals, some of whom we discuss in the book, and the efforts that they've made over the years to firstly try to stop independence happening in 2006, and then trying to discredit Montenegro in one way or another after it. It's been it's an ongoing endeavor. And of course, the Serbian Orthodox Church is without question the most important Serbian institution in Montenegro. I mean, you could even argue that it's the most powerful institution in Montenegro. And certainly we've seen lots of examples throughout the 1990s, actually a little bit less so in the early 2000s, and certainly towards the referendum. I was relatively surprised that the Serbian Orthodox Church took the position that they did, which was, of course, to discourage independence, but they could have been more politically active at that time, and they weren't. 2020, of course, was completely different, or 2019, 2020 with the Litier and so forth. And there's no question that the Serbian Orthodox Church created the conditions, the political conditions, or the political landscape in which the opposition could win the August 2020 elections. Because prior to that, if you look at what happened in Montenegrin politics since the referendum, what the DPS did successfully, even if you can say the DPS were terrible at governing, they were a poor party of government, right? And they were eventually thrown out in 2020. What they did do really effectively is that they always made sure that they could break the opposition in some way. So if there was a promising party, if we take the example of Pozitivna, you remember the first post-referendum elections, Pozitivna did really well. And then somehow they were brought into the system, into the DPS system in coalition, and then that involved lots of trade-offs and deals and so forth, and then they become part of the system. And the DPS used to do that extremely well. They always governed in coalition, but there was no ambiguity about who was the leading partner in that coalition. It was a DPS-led coalition. That's how everyone used to refer to it. And what they did really effectively was they made sure that the opposition were always very divided, and almost nothing could bring together the opposition effectively enough to challenge the DPS. But then the decision was taken to push this law on religious freedoms, and of course that was the spark, if you like, that activated this Serbian Orthodox Church, and they became politicized by the thought that they might have this imposed upon them. So you could say possibly it was a fairly significant strategic error on behalf of the DPS to go down that road at a time when they knew there were elections coming, relatively soon, that this might be a hard sell, that there might be opposition to this. But, governments that have been in power for as long as the DPS had, there's a certain amount of let's say, confidence that regardless of what they do, if they push something through, there might be a bit of resistance, but they'll get there. If you think about NATO membership, there was quite a bit of resistance to NATO membership. And of course, there were calls to have a referendum on NATO membership, and it didn't happen. And once Montenegro had joined, the whole thing kind of, began to calm down a bit. I suspect the thinking was that the same would happen with the law on religious freedoms, but of course it didn't. And it allowed the Serbian Orthodox Church to activate themselves really effectively as a political actor, which they did and still do. Although you might say that the Serbian Orthodox Church are less visible than they were because, Amfilohi was a unique character. But you can clearly see the influence that the Serbian Orthodox Church has on Montenegro. It's far more visible just in terms of the number of churches that have been rebuilt, the number of, you just see the influence far more than you would have seen, let's say, at the early 2000s or the mid 2000s. It's far more evident, and they are, of course, the main channel of Serbian influence in Montenegro. Of course, you have political parties. You've always had those pro-Serb political parties. They were active before the referendum. They've evolved in different ways. And now you have, some of those parties in government. I mean, obviously, Andrija Mandić is the key player in that regard because he's been around for so long. He's a very experienced politician. He's been part of that scene for a long time. Very close to Belgrade. Those parties that have very close relationships with interlocutors in Belgrade and with Vučić exist in Montenegro, and currently, some of those parties are in power. So there's media. Media's important as well. The media landscape is changing a lot. The youth are not buying newspapers in the same way that they used to. I mean, a newspaper like, let's say, Monitor, which, did some fantastic journalism in Montenegro for, over decades, really important publication, is probably got a very small circulation now. People are not reading those kind of deeply critical or deeply analytical pieces. Everyone is getting information from social media or from online sources. And I think one of the things that was really interesting to me about the Liti, and bearing in mind that I was watching this during lockdown, it was COVID in the UK. It was impossible for me to go to Montenegro. It was the way that it was all done through social media, through TikTok, through Facebook, through Twitter, as it was at that time, did it very, very effectively. And I'll tell you an interesting story before I finish. I once met a Serbian intellectual who was very involved in the whole, he was resisting the referendum in 2006. And he told me that in 1997, when Bulatović, you remember that Đukanović became president, I think it was the early days of 1998, Đukanović was about to be appointed as president. That event was to take place in Cetinje. And there was a protest at the TV station in Podgorica and then at the so-called Two Coffins at the government building in Podgorica. And there was, the protesters tried to break into the building. And he said to me that we looked amateur. We looked, scruffy, not well organized. We looked like a rowdy crowd, a rabble. The next time we do this, we'll be more organized. And I think that there were people behind the scenes that were extremely well organized when it came to 2020. They saw their opportunity and they had been preparing for it for a long time and they took it. That said, August 2020 has not actually led to the dominance of pro-Serb parties in Montenegro. It's led to this rather kind of series of, quite tricky coalitions.
Would you say that the 2020 elections and, let's say, the political aftermath of Litije led to the democratization of the country? When we look back at your previous book and also before that book was published, you also published 2 articles at the 5-year benchmark since the referendum and at the 10-year benchmark since the referendum. And my reading of those articles and the chapters in the previous book is that it's kind of a different conclusion. The first one, the 5-year one, was a bit more positive than the 2016 one. So maybe taking that into account, when you look back, it's been almost 5 years now, or more than 5 years now since the 2020 elections. Would you say that that was a key milestone in the democratization of Montenegro, or did the political situation stay pretty much the same, or even worse?
It's a really good question. And I think it was always going to be challenging when you have had a system, basically. The DPS were more than a political party. They were, a kind of system, and they were okay, they became the DPS in 1990 or 1991, and they were in power for 3 decades. It was always going to be difficult to make that transition. There had been no, certainly through the mechanism of elections, political change in Montenegro for a long time. It came from, splits within the DPS and then Đukanović going one way, Bulatović going another. That changed the direction of Montenegrin politics. But it was all from within the system. It wasn't, parties from outside the system that had been elected and were coming to power and that things were going to change. So when it happened in August 2020 and the opposition came to power, albeit, with a one-seat majority, it was very narrow. It was the beginning of a process which is leading to greater democratization. I mean, I can't envisage a situation again where DPS could be as dominant as they ever were in the past. I just can't see it happening. So what you're going to have in Montenegro is probably years and years of coalition government, maybe permanent coalition government, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. Because, coming from a country that traditionally had two political poles, the left, right, Labour and the Tories, I mean, that definition of left and right is outdated in that context. But, you could choose one or the other. And they could be quite uncompromising because they didn't need to compromise. They had a majority in the parliament. Or in Montenegro, what you have is more like the German system, where you have coalition governments constantly. We haven't yet had a grand coalition in Montenegro, which would involve maybe the DPS and PES or something. But it's going to be coalition government, and coalition government can be really difficult. It can be complicated, but it can lead to parties having to compromise with each other. It can lead to a situation where you end up taking a middle path rather than more radical paths. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. But it was never going to be easy to make that transition from 3 decades of DPS rule all the way through to, well, no democracy is perfect. And Montenegro's democracy won't be perfect either. But if we think about the possibilities of newer parties emerging and new political entities, new ideas developing in Montenegro, and actually becoming possible for them to have some kind of political power, is more likely now than it was in the past. So there is a kind of democratic landscape there that is an improvement from what existed in the past. And you're right. I think the book that I published in 2018, I was perhaps less positive than I'd been 5 years after independence, because I felt, in a sense, that, well, I remember people saying to me in 2006, once we have all these foreign embassies, once we have all these international organizations, it won't be possible for the DPS to just control everything the way that they have done. It will have to change. It will lead to democratization. And of course, it didn't happen. And still by 2018, I'm, writing the book 12 years after the independence referendum, and the DPS were still in power at that time. So I think there was a sense and that many Montenegrins, the Montenegrin public had, that, nothing was changing and nothing had changed. And I suppose I felt a little bit like that myself. I'm not sure I certainly wouldn't have predicted the nature of the political change when it happened in 2020. But I think the change was necessary at some point. So yes, you're in a different political environment now, and difficult, but it will take time. But it's worth doing. It's part of the democratic process.
My reading of the book is that it's not really structured in that way, but they're kind of like two parts of the book itself. One part is related to internal dynamics within Montenegro and within Serbia, and that part of the book is also related to the relationship between the two. And then there is another section of the book which addresses foreign influence within both of these countries, specifically Chinese influence or the varying degrees of Chinese and Russian influence in both Montenegro and Serbia. And last month when we did the promotion of this book at the law faculty of University of Montenegro with Vesko Garčević, he told a very interesting story about how I think this was his second or third book promotion of this book, A Velvet Divorce. And international audiences were very much interested into these chapters that dealt with Chinese and Russian influence and didn't want to hear or talk about the internal political dynamics and the relationship between Serbia and Montenegro. But on the other hand, here the majority or entirely, exclusively discussion centered around this issue or these topics. So my question to you in this regard would be, we already dedicated a bit of the discussion to the role of Serbia in Montenegrin politics, and also to tie back everything with something you said in the first session. You said that Montenegro was kind of forgotten in European memory, in European history, and I guess it's also one of the reasons why wider international audience is not really familiar with internal political dynamics. So my question here would be, how can this relationship between Serbia and Montenegro and internal political dynamics, how it should be communicated so that it appeals to international audience?
Another very good question, and one I've been asking myself for many years. When we do, and we do from time to time, let's say in London, we run an event talking about the themes that were raised in the book or on previous books, and the vast majority of the audience are diaspora. So they're Montenegrins living in London or Serbs living in London or in Brussels or wherever. And they come with a very particular view of events and the relationship between Serbia and Montenegro and modern Serbian and Montenegrin history. It's much more difficult to engage an international audience in these this history and this politics, because it's seen, well, I'll give you a perfect example. One EU policymaker said to me recently, there's only 18 million people living in the Western Balkans. So, from a sort of geopolitical, and bearing in mind that, European leaders are thinking about these things these days. This is a small area, the Western Balkans. It's, they're not yet members of the European Union. Croatia's in, Slovenia's in, but, nobody else is yet at that point. It's difficult to get traction, even though these are very, very important. I mean, this relationship in particular between Serbia and Montenegro, I think, is extremely important. And Europeans need to understand the dynamics of the relationships between countries like Serbia and Montenegro and what the potential risks are. And one of the things I think that we suffer from in Western Europe is the ability of people to really understand places like Montenegro or like Serbia, or in my case, writing about Sanjak, which is Sanjak is a very complex place. It operates by its own rules. In Novi Pazar, things are very different from Belgrade. It takes a lot to be able to understand that. And once you come back with all that knowledge and that information, you've written this book and you present it to an audience for an hour, you do indeed find that most of the questions are asked, if it's an international audience or a British audience, or they're asking about the international dynamics. They're not asking about the domestic politics, and they're not asking about relationships between countries in the region. I think the best that somebody like I can do as a historian, I write books. Hopefully people read them. You have read them clearly on the basis of your knowledge of the content of each one. And I think it's, this is an important region. Montenegro is an important country. Montenegro is a small country, but it's a pretty complicated place historically and politically. It's important that people know about it. So, I suppose it's the job of people like me to bring that to wider audiences and hope to that people would take an interest and they might, you know, seek to understand a little bit better the politics and the history, not just of Montenegro, but of the region more broadly.
That's precisely the reason why I believe this book is very important. Thank you very much, Professor Morrison, for this conversation once again. We are out of time, and I hope we'll meet again, either in person or over Zoom calls in the near future. Goodbye.
Thank you very much. It was my pleasure. Thank you.
Poštovani gledalci, pratili ste razgovor sa profesorom Kennethom Morrisonom, historičarem. Hvala vam na pažnji i prijatno večer.